Okay, today I have the great pleasure of getting a chance to talk to Mike Hodnick. Mike works under the artist name Kindohm, or it might be spelled Kindohm, O-H-M, if you are so interested. Mike assures me that he'll accept either pronunciation. But with that, this is our first time talking, even though I'm about to go see him at a little workshop. But let's get to know him a little bit together. Hey, Mike, how's it going?
Very good.
Thank you so much for taking the time out to have a chat. I really appreciate it.
Yep, no problem.
Why don't we start off by having you talk a little bit about your Kindohm artwork and how you produce that kind of stuff?
It's kind of a broad moniker I use for all of the electronic production I do. I'm typically drawn to kind of almost club bass music type sounds, but I'm not really interested in straight ahead techno music or I like kind of bringing more of a kind of a twisted approach to those sounds. And my method of production is also a little unconventional, using programming and live coding techniques and programming languages to sequence sounds and also do a little bit of the sound design as well. So that's that's what I like to do.
Sure. When you talk about using programming languages, what are the languages that you're using?
The one that I use most often is Haskell, and I use this library called Tidalcycles. Tidal is a Tidal, Tidalcycles. That's the main library within Haskell that I use. I'm not really a Haskell programmer. If you asked me to write a Haskell program, I could not really do it for you. But this Tidalcycles library does make sense to me, and I can write Haskell code that kind of fits within the rules of Tidalcycles. I also use JavaScript, which is more of a web programming language, which relates more of what I do for my day job. But there are some audio capabilities as well within web browsers, and I've done a little bit of that as well.
Interesting. It when you said Haskell, my teeth almost fell out because for me, all of the people that I've ever seen who talk about Haskell, were definitely sort of like overloaded with the pocket protector action.
Sure.
It's like super nerdy, ultra CS academic kind of a language, and not something you think of as really a creative tool.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think there's kind of a renaissance of those styles of languages. So when I say styles, I mean a functional language,
Hmm.
functional programming being a very specific thing, functional programming as opposed to object-oriented programming or as opposed to procedural programming. So Haskell, along with other functional languages, JavaScript has some functional capabilities as well.
Yeah,
Elm, Erlang. I'm not a functional programmer, so I'm going to struggle to
sure.
mention many more. But I think it's also a style of programming that kind of lends itself to what Tidalcycles does with music and patterning, a way of kind of chaining functions together to create an output. So I think it kind of lends itself to what I do, or to what Tidalcycles wants to accomplish.
Right. So for people who aren't familiar with functional programming, my sort of like bigger than a bread box explanation is that it really is, instead of building an object that has a ton of functionality, what you kind of do is you build a bunch of utility functions and you pump the data through it. And you build up complexity by chaining together groups of functions, right?
Yeah, I
Kind
think that's
of?
a one way or a good way to explain it. Yeah, rather than objects that have a lot of state
Right.
properties, or you have functions that just process data. You have inputs and outputs. So in a functional program, the program is continuously sending inputs into functions that are composed in such a way to give you a result. And
Right.
you can even put functions into functions and have a very complex chain of stuff. But yeah, that's the idea.
Interesting. Sounds like fractal programming in some horrific way.
Sure. Yeah.
So, what is it about? Tidal Cycles that speaks to you from an artistic standpoint?
Yeah, so when I first saw it, I immediately thought it would be really fun. I just recognized it as something that would resonate with me with what I wanted to do with composition or electronic music composition. I had done some DAW based composition before that, which I always thought was challenging and kind of a square peg round hole situation for me.
Mm-hmm.
But when me being a programmer for my day job, when I saw Tidal Cycles and I saw a video demonstration of it, I thought, okay, I know I can make this work because of my technical background, but I also saw like immediately this great, deep, rich path kind of laid out in front of me. Like, okay, I can take a lot of the sounds, samples, techniques that I've acquired through my DAW-based experience and then apply it to Tidal Cycles. But I think what I was most interested in was kind of rhythmic density and complexity,
Mm-hmm.
more conditional rules of when and how a pattern, like a musical pattern, should behave. For example, kind of using more traditional musical terms like measures or beats. If every 3 measures shift time in this direction by 1/4 of a beat, every 5 measures raise everything up by this pitch, and have kind of this logic based approach or conditional based approach to when things should happen, and you have this kind of a resulting tree of musical patterns that could take a very long time to repeat.
Right.
Instead of laying out 100 measures in a DAW, I could just express the same thing in a few lines of code. So that was
Sure.
really the attraction there.
And that's the kind of structures that Tidal Cycles provides. It's like uh, every this often do this kind of thing, but it speaks in musical terms.
I think at its core, Tidal Cycles is really just a patterning language, and a musical output is kind of its default result or its default behavior.
Mm-hmm.
You can use Tidal Cycles to produce an image or to send out data on a network in some pattern. It just so happens that it couples itself with a sample synthesizer that runs in Super Collider
Mm.
that receives OSC messages. So
Ah,
really, all Tidal Cycles is doing is sending out OSC messages.
okay.
So, but to kind of get back at what you were asking, there's a way that you write patterns in Tidal Cycles just using kind of some string text. You put inside of double quotes what you want your pattern to sound like, starting with the names of sounds or samples, bass drum, snare drum, bass note, whatever you want to name your samples. And then kind of to the left or on top of that pattern string, you can start defining these conditional functions. So I wouldn't say the conditional functions are required or a necessary part. The core of Tidal is really that string pattern that you're typing, how you want to arrange your sounds in a certain pattern.
Interesting. You kind of answered the next question I had, which was how do you take these patterns and turn them into sound? And so you say it really is just piping OSC data over to a Super Collider sample playback device?
Yeah, that's kind of the default mode of Tidal Cycles,
Okay.
is to be a musical language that, well, results in music. I shouldn't say it's a musical language.
Right.
It's a patterning language that will send these messages over a network, OSC messages, to the Super Collider synth. The name of this synth is called Super Dirt, but that's a different discussion. So yeah, it can really do anything. It can just work with data locally on your own computer, or it can send these messages across the network. It can also work with MIDI. There is a MIDI plugin available for Tidal Cycles to write the same types of patterns and conditional logic with an analog synthesizer or a Eurorack modular synth. It doesn't send out CV, but through MIDI you can convert that to CV,
Right.
CV signals. So yeah, it primarily works over a network with OSC, kind of in its main mode of operation.
Yeah, now one of the things that I'll say, so I went over to your SoundCloud site, and I'll make sure that that's listed in the show notes for people to check out.
Mm-hmm.
I went over there and I was listening to a bunch of it, and it's really compelling music. It's really there's a lot of density, but there's also like it's like coupled with clarity. It's almost like you talk about these overlaying structures. It's almost like you can hear them kind of developing, right?
Okay,
But
sure.
it's unlike what I'm used to hearing when I hear particularly people that are doing live coding. I there's one similarity between like live coding people and looper people, which is that the arc of a performance always tends to sort of sound like, okay, I'm going to make one sound, now I'm going to add a second, now I'm going to add
Right.
a third, now I'm going to add a fourth, now I'm going to take away that third one, now I'm going to take away the fourth one, and I'll add back in the third one. It's sort of like this build up and then tear down kind of thing, right?
Yep.
And that kind of arc is almost indicative of that kind of mechanism being done. Your stuff didn't sound like that. Is that just because of how you edited it, or is it just how you tend to operate the system?
It's more of a conscious decision to operate it like that now.
Okay.
When I first started using Tidal cycles and really discovering the practice of live coding, I did more of what you are describing, where I would start from scratch and build up some basic sounds from nothing. Starting with a bass drum or whatever I felt was interesting, some textural sound or whatever. Add things in, let that whole thing evolve over the course of 20, 30, 60 minutes, whatever that might be, continuously change that composition as it goes and really just improvise. And I performed live like that a few times, and it was super exhilarating and at the same time extremely stressful.
Right.
And it wasn't that I was displeased with the result, but I think that I was searching for a different mode of production or performance. So at one performance I did, I decided I would kind of half prepare like these skeletons of a song or a composition ahead of time and kind of work with them. So instead of going completely from scratch, kind of build these lightweight skeletons of a track or a song, and then kind of transition between them. So still leaving a lot of room for improvisation, but not necessarily starting from scratch,
Mm-hmm.
and still having a framework to work from. So that the first time I did that, it worked for me. It's not necessarily going to work for everybody else, but I enjoy preparing that and I enjoy performing like that. And so I think what you're hearing on my SoundCloud page is more of those prepared types of pieces where, yes,
Sure.
this is a kind of a small composition. And on SoundCloud, I will just kind of record a segment of that.
Right.
I tend to not really throw out completed tracks on SoundCloud anymore. But yeah, I will kind of record a snippet of that skeleton in a certain state, and then that's what you're hearing on SoundCloud.
Got it. So one of the things that I like doing in my podcast, and I'm going to ask you to play along with me on this one, is to learn a little bit about the background of the people that I talk to. And I'm curious about where you're coming from because you actually seem equally comfortable talking either about the musicality or about the technicality, right? You seem
Yeah,
to have fluid facility on both sides. And I'm always curious about where people like this come from because it's not a natural state of affairs, I don't think. I so oftentimes find either people that are very technical and have trouble making being able to discuss the musical side of what they do, or conversely, people who are very comfortable with the music and tend to be stymied by the technology. And I'm a little
sure.
curious, what's your background and how did you get to be so comfortable with both sides of that track?
I'll answer that as best I can.
Okay.
um, when I was growing up, I played piano and also grew up as a kind of a classically trained percussionist, as well as drum set. So I grew up playing in school bands, high school, junior high, wind ensembles, orchestras, youth orchestras. Then in college, went down more of a industrial engineering path academically, but still played in university wind ensembles, jazz groups, percussion ensembles. So I definitely had a musical side of me, at least kind of as a performer in a group setting or an ensemble setting, as I carried out my engineering studies. And all of my all my friends called me a music major wannabe because that's where I spent all my time. I didn't really spend time in the engineering commons. I was always in the humanities area up at the University of Minnesota Duluth, where I was going to school, in the practice rooms, hanging out with the music majors. So, but I knew as a career path, I definitely had this engineering hat that I wanted to wear. So I always imagined that music would be a part of me and what I wanted to do for in my life, but not necessarily as a career. So I really kind of took a break from a lot of musical performance after college. Maybe 5 years later, really got into home recording and kind of guitar and drums and vocal production, just because I was interested in a lot of the nuts and bolts of the technical aspect of that. How do you record, do a multi-track recording? How do you mix stuff? How do you produce stuff? How do you get something to sound good? This was before I even got into electronic production. In the meantime, during all of this, I'd really gotten into programming and web development, and kind of on the job side, had really gone more of the programming path. But in my spare time was really obsessed with just music production and mixing and those sorts of things. So I got into the electronic DAW-based production eventually, and a lot of those same kind of technical music production concepts carried over. And in a way, I even felt they were easier with electronics because I didn't have to be concerned about microphones or the room I was in for sound quality anymore. But I think music to me has always been kind of a balance of a technical challenge as well as, a compositional challenge as well. From an early age, albums would turn me on or turn me off based on the production quality. I would really be interested in, well, why do I like this sound of this album? Why do I dislike that one? And try and understand what I liked about the arrangements or the sounds. And a lot of the artists I was interested in, I found that I was really interested in the production and the producer more than maybe the artists themselves. So I guess I just always had an ear for kind of that critical ear of understanding how a track or an album was produced, and it became almost a game or just this research project of how did that producer do that. And so I think those are maybe some components of the answer of
Sure.
what led me kind of down the technical path of why the technical aspects of music intrigue me, as well as maybe with my performance background, why I kind of have that more creative side as well that's also comfortable.
Right. So sometimes finding out what a producer or an engineer or a technically savvy artist has done to produce their sound is obscured either because they never mention it or they go out of their way to obscure the way that they did the work. How were you able to gain information about that? What did you do to find out more, and where did that eventually lead you? I mean, who are some of your artists and what did that lead to?
Oh, sure. Well, kind of thinking back to when I was doing kind of multi-track recording my drum set, recording a guitar and an amplifier, recording my voice, and being completely unsatisfied, wondering how the heck do I make this actually sound good? This was back before social media and before a lot of information sharing. So it was a lot of trying to read up in books, or like the Tape Op magazine. I had a subscription to that, just trying to read about what producers were doing. I also had a few friends that I could lean on too. There was a friend of mine up in Duluth, and I would email him every so often, and he'd have some suggestions about how to improve the clarity of a snare drum or things like that. So it was a lot of trial and error, and very frustrating at times. And then I think over time, with the emergence of modern digital audio workstations like whether it's Ableton or FL Studio or Pro Tools, I think a lot more of these secrets started to come out a little bit because the tools themselves kind of presented more feedback or data about what you were doing. Anyway, you were asking about artists. I'm trying to think of some specific examples. I listen to a lot of, as far as rock bands go, I loved bands like Helmet and 311 on the jazz side of things. I listened to a lot of Miles Davis, Clifford Brown, a lot of Chick Corea and Return to Forever. And even though those were older recordings, they sounded good. So I wasn't necessarily looking for, modern production sounds or techniques, but using old vintage equipment, how did people get things to sound so clearly? On the electronic side, I was really into a lot more like breakcore and drum and bass, jungle types of influences, which probably explains where some of my interest in rhythmic density might come from. But layering of multiple drum parts together with a melody component and a bass component, and how do you get those things to sound clear in a mix together? Because the first time I tried it, it would just sound like a muddled mess. And that's when you start to learn, okay, you can create some frequency space for these things and EQ treatment, and those things started to make sense through learning and some modern tools and trial and error.
Sure. The other thing is, though, growing up doing percussion, drums and percussion and stuff, I mean, that also gave you sort of some early experience. So even if you're doing the most basic percussion in a school band kind of environment or something like that, you end up running into different kinds of rhythms and different rhythmic figures that aren't necessarily the things that just come rolling out of a drum machine if that's how you learn, right?
Yeah, you're exactly right. The phrasing is different. You're fitting in a part with a greater picture, a bigger picture,
Right.
rather than just thinking in terms of 16 steps or another limitation like that.
Yeah.
Which, to maybe kind of bridge a little bit with Tidalcycles, Tidalcycles really it does not have a 16-step limit or a 64-step limit, for example. You can have any amount of subdivisions you like within the concept of a tidal cycle or measure, which kind of getting at what you were saying with playing percussion in a wind ensemble. You have a larger picture you're fitting in. You don't have to conform to 16 steps. So yeah, maybe there is something there of why another reason why Tidalcycles was appealing.
Right. So what is it that drew you into, I mean, is it just the kind of engineering mentality that drew you into computers, or did computers draw you into engineering thought? I mean, which came first?
I think engineering first. And it's kind of funny. I knew that I wanted to go to college, and I thought, I think an engineering career would make sense for me. I was good at math and the sciences, and I knew engineering would be a good fit for me. But kind of through a process of elimination, I chose industrial engineering, which in retrospect, I would never choose now. But it is more about, manufacturing processes.
It's process, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Rather than chemical engineering or computer engineering would have been a great fit. But so there is maybe a great, support of the answer. I actually chose industrial engineering over computer engineering or soft computer science. So the programming aspect came after that engineering choice. This was back in the late 90s with the emergence of the World Wide Web and HTML programming and the HTTP protocol, to nerd out on a musical podcast. So I thought the World Wide Web was so cool when I thought, hey, as a student at college, I can have my own directory with my own web pages. I want to do that. That sounds fun. I could put whatever information I wanted on it and style it however I wanted, and I was hooked. And that was kind of my programming bug after I started my studies on the engineering side.
So now, talking about the choices you've made for your current artistry, I'm curious why Tidalcycles and not one of the more established textual languages. I mean, Super Collider is the obvious choice, but going all the way back to like C Sound, there's the web audio stuff, JavaScript. There's a lot of different options for doing sound and sequencing in a textual language, why tidal cycles?
I guess I recognize tidal cycles as a way to very, very quickly express sequences in a very small amount of code. Um, and it's also a very live environment, meaning that you can type something and immediately have it change, as opposed to having to recompile your program to then change the sound output. So Tidal Cycles was built from the start with this idea of a very concise way of putting a pattern in a small amount of text and then evaluating it in an editor and then immediately having the sound output change. Now, I don't have experience with C sound, so I can't speak to that. Thinking of some of the other things you mentioned, now Super Collider does have that liveness component. It also has that ability to where you can evaluate it and then have the sound change immediately. I guess I learned about tidal cycles before I learned about Super Collider, and I learned about Super Collider shortly after. I guess by my own laziness, I just recognized tidal cycles as a very immediate way to start composing and creating the patterns I was kind of interested in, the things I was hearing in my head. I knew I could do it with Tidal quickly.
Sure.
With Super Collider, it looked more of like a synthesis environment. I didn't hear as much of the complex sequencing going on that I was really interested in.
That's a really great point. And in fact, it's kind of funny because you actually sounded a little apologetic about being, quote, lazy, but that would be like saying, somebody who picks up and loves the guitar saying, well, you can play more notes on a piano, so why didn't you choose piano?
Sure, yeah.
That's not necessarily a sensical statement,
Yeah. So I mean, there are Super Collider users who do similar things to what I do. A little bit of composition, a little bit of improv, a fair amount of sequencing, and they do some amazing stuff. I think it's just kind of recognizing the language and its capabilities as something that resonates with you. Just like choosing guitar over piano. It's an instrument that you set your hands on it and poof, it clicks. That's the best way I can explain Tidal. I've tried other things like Sonic Pi. There's also a few other. There's a live coding. I've tried Chuck. I've tried another environment called Jibber, which is a web browser based live coding tool. Really, every single one of those is extremely powerful, and the users who use those things and do it well, I mean, they're phenomenal artists who pull off great things. But when I've tried to give them a shot, they don't resonate with me, and Tidal Cycles doesn't resonate with them, and that's the beauty of it.
So it goes, right. So I'm curious, when you talk about sort of building up skeletons for performance works, what does that look like? Does that look like a library of subroutines? Does that look like a shell of a program? Does it look like a bunch of code in a buffer that you copy and paste? What does that kind of setup look like?
So kind of thinking of it from maybe a live performance standpoint, what I will do is I will kind of arrange the individual files. So I'll have files saved with code that's ready to go. And the code might be a 2-line thing, or it might be 20 lines, depending on what it is. And I will have 5 to 10 files ready to go. And yeah, they are really just kind of partial snippets of things, or they may have more complete ideas that are muted or commented out that I will then enable or edit when it's ready to go. Sure. But yeah, I will either flip through these files in order, or sometimes I'll even, just before the performance, kind of put them all into one big file in order, and kind of go top to bottom and just stream through one file, move from one idea to the next.
Now, is everything done at the keyboard, or do you have like an external controller that you'll use in conjunction?
For the most part, it's 100% on the keyboard. If I get into a tight spot, I might use my trackpad if I need to mouse around a little bit. But for the most part, I'm 100% on the keyboard, and I'm actually typing. And it's just small edits of removing and adding things as I go, sometimes some larger edits. Have been times where I have incorporated a MIDI controller to add a little bit of effects for things like a filter sweep or something like that for a more continuous effect, to make sounds come in and out. So when I'm running Tidal cycles, the sound is getting pumped through my DAW through a master channel, and then I may have a MIDI controller just control a high or a low pass filter on that master, something simple like that. I
Sure.
have also used some analog synthesizers live using the MIDI library with Tidal cycles, and I will do some manual tweaking on those just because it's fun.
Do you prefer that, or is it like again a different instrument almost?
I typically don't perform with keyboard synthesizer, so I'm mainly just kind of tweaking knobs
Mm-hmm.
and mainly kind of using it to affect the tonal quality of something that's already playing.
Got it.
And yeah, I do enjoy it because it's a totally different experience. It,
Right.
it is kind of it's a big context change. So I'm going from code editing to now looking at a layout of knobs and switches on a synth. I mean, it's not like it's a difficult context change, I guess, but I may try and fade in a part using a filter or a gain knob, or change what the depth of an envelope, as something is playing, and try to juggle code and those tweaks
Sure.
at the same time.
Now I'll say this: there is kind of a big movement away from using like laptops in live performance, with the sole exception that it's acceptable to be using one if you're doing live coding. So it seems like live coding is like the holdout for, allowing a laptop on stage. Otherwise, people are really moving towards, whether it's Electron boxes or MPCs or whatever, as sort of
Mm.
like their control mechanism. But one of the things I've noticed is that live coders, one of sort of like again another commonality in live coding is that often the visuals that accompany the live coder are a screenshot of them live coding, meaning that their visuals of their gig is literally the text editor showing them
Oh,
editing, right?
oh, right, yeah. I think that's kind of in the spirit of what a lot of live coding artists like to do. They like to
Right.
project their screens as they perform.
Right.
Um, in fact, I think there's a good, healthy debate amongst live coders if you should or shouldn't do that. To me, it's personal choice if you want to.
Uh-huh.
I like to do it because I guess to me, coming from a traditional musical background, playing percussion, playing piano, that feeling of liveness and my hands are actually making a change in the sound. I guess that's part of my DNA. Like I want to have a physical impact on the changes to a sound, and I guess having the audience be able to see or detect that, it just feels good, feels comfortable to me. I have performed without a projector, without projecting my screen before, and that's fine too, because I guess at the end of the day, the most important thing is the musical output.
Right.
But but yeah, I guess there is something in me that wants to convey, hey, this is live, and this is what I'm doing. I don't necessarily want to show menus and my DAW stuff. I'm going to try and just focus on that text editor, and hopefully nothing goes wrong where I have to switch from that. And just kind of, it's a kind of a cool aesthetic where you've got text on a wall or whatever.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess I like to do it. I think it's cool to do.
Well, I think that it's kind of interesting too because, well, first of all, it's unlike other stuff because you'd never really want to watch a DAW user like work on a piano roll.
Right.
Nor would you especially want to see somebody like scratching in, semiquavers on a finale screen, right?
Sure. Yeah.
But the flip side of it is, again, another thing I notice is that it sort of opens the doors for like a real nerdy kind of humor too. I've noticed that coders a lot of times, live coders will a lot of times build in like either puns into, into things, or when they're doing repetition or copies or whatever, they'll in some way highlight things. So it's sort of like, if you're savvy and if you're paying attention, or if you really know that environment, you actually can kind of get an inside joke that just
Yeah.
really isn't available in kind of any other means.
Yeah, you're exactly right. It could be through just code comments. You
Mm-hmm.
can even have a conversation with the audience too. It can get downright silly at times.
Right.
But yeah, there are some of those inside jokes too. So in my code, when I want to mute a part, I could use a more conventional way of doing it, where I literally tell something to mute or to stop. Which there's more than one way to do that. I guess the way you would do that normally in Tidalcycles is you would set the gain of a part equal to 0, and I
Right.
would type gain quote 0 quote to set the gain of a pattern to 0.
Mm-hmm.
So I created an alias for that, which is GTFO, which in internet slang means something specific. So
Right.
I type GTFO, and that stops the part from playing. There was a gig I played last October, and it was actually the live coding conference in Hamilton, Ontario. And I had that come up where I typed GTFO, and yeah, the first row of people right by me just started cracking up because they thought that was pretty funny. Yeah, there's definitely an opportunity for some inside jokes and kind of that type of conversation with the audience at that level.
Right. It's pretty funny. Well, and conversely, there is something for this kind of challenging music where it does tend to be sort of like an insider's game anyway.
Sure. Yep. Yep.
And, as genres have become, mini genres which have calved off nano genres, it seems like the people that come to our gigs are people who have some very specific knowledge. They either like, in my case, I noticed for a while, people who were like intrigued with a certain kind of module I used in my modular rig would come check it out because they wanted to hear somebody use that live, right?
Right.
And I
Right.
was like, okay, well, that is in a way kind of an inside, maybe not an inside joke, but inside knowledge that is kind of unique to that particular super subgenre, right?
Right.
And so it's
Yep.
kind of interesting to think of live coding as having those kind of things going on as well.
Yeah. There is a bit of that. I think in a way, when you can pick out the live coders in the room because they are first and foremost the people who are pretty much just standing and staring at what you're typing, almost more than just listening or moving to the music.
Right.
And we all do it. I'm guilty of that as well. So
So
yeah,
the one thing I'm curious about though is, and this is something I'll have to say I've never seen, is is it possible, and if so, how would live coders ever work in an ensemble environment? How would you ever collaborate with someone else?
oh, that's a great question. So I guess there's two main approaches to that. It may be a technological limitation or not, but you can either share the same clock or not. That's the issue.
Mm-hmm.
You can either try to sync up if you're doing something rhythmic by ear or by nudging time in your environment, or you can literally just try and go free and not sync up. So certain environments, Tidalcycles being one, can share a clock between multiple machines. I guess, and it's not necessarily easy to do yet. In the Tidalcycles community, we are trying to develop a means of synchronization using the Ableton Link protocol. Right. We've created it does work on Linux and Mac OS, but we're struggling to get it to work on Windows. Windows being forever the trouble child in the open source community. Problem child, I mean. Anyway, you can sync up that way. In Super Collider, there are some libraries that folks have developed to synchronize multiple machines together. But once you solve that problem, then it's kind of I would suggest that it's just like improvising with any other instrument, that at that point you are now thinking of the space you're occupying when you're playing with somebody else, or how you're
And the space you're leaving open for others, right?
Yeah, exactly. You can also improvise, of course, with other non-computer instruments as well, which is maybe getting a little bit ahead of your question, but there's I recently did an improv with piano and electric bass, which was fun. But anyway, in kind of the live coding context, if you can solve that clock and synchronization problem, it eases some of the challenges a bit. Yeah, it can be pretty fun.
Sure, interesting.
It can also be disastrous. if that synchronization source kind of crashes or you have problems, and then that happened. We tried doing a synchronized improv at a show in Hopkins, Minnesota here last year, and the network failed, and it took us a while to recognize that every change we were making was not going through, and it was just this endless loop of the same sound over and over, and literally had to pull the plug to stop it.
Oh wow!
But hey, that was a thing, and
That was
that
a
happened,
thing,
and
right?
that was fun.
Very interesting. So our time is just about up. I can't believe it, but I do want to ask you about one other thing. You mentioned that your SoundCloud site tends to be snippets of things where you turn on the recorder and you play something, right? And then you also have a Bandcamp site where you have like 8 releases out.
Yeah.
For you, what is the difference between performing and recording?
Okay, let's
It's
see. How
always
do
a
I answer that?
curiosity for me. I'm
Yeah.
always curious about how people basically segment their brains to basically say, "Okay, I'm working on a recording now." You
hmm
know?
At the moment, they're pretty related and connected. I try. I'm interested in performing the things that I record with some embellishments or with some variations. So when I record, it's a carefully crafted composition or piece of code, and I will do multiple takes, or maybe if I'm lucky, a single take of something to when I'm pleased with it. Um, and I honestly, when I'm doing a recording, the code is doing more of the talking than my typing is.
Hmm.
Most of my studio work is static code that's not necessarily live. The compositional process is very much live for me as I'm improvising and figuring it out. But the recording itself there's a lot less improv going on at that point.
I see.
But then I will take that composition when my recording, maybe remove or scale back some stuff, and then that becomes the skeleton. Take that live, and then I will add or improvise with it, and it may resemble something close to the recording when it's live as well. That's kind of how that works.
That's really interesting because in a way that's sort of like, I mean, there throughout the history of recording, band recordings, right? There's always been two approaches. There's been like the go to the studio, make a thing, and then figure out how to play it live, or make up something live, bring it to the studio, and
Mm,
document it, right?
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
it seems like an awful lot of people in the synth world or in the electronic music world, it seems like a lot of people kind of do that second thing if they're live performers. The live
Sure.
performance really drives what they record. It's interesting to hear you talk about kind of taking the reverse approach.
I suppose. I've never done the other approach myself, but yeah, no, I guess every live coder is different too, or
Right.
every electronic artist is different. There's something in me that likes to perform the compositions, and I guess maybe because of my more traditional musical background, that's you open up the real book and we're gonna play this song. Okay, that's I guess that's where maybe that some of that mentality comes from.
Indeed.
A quick note: you mentioned my Bandcamp page. There is another. I guess my latest release was out on a different Bandcamp label called Conditional. Conditional is a fantastic label where they support a lot of innovative and very creative computer artists. I guess computer music artists, and that may include some modular synth work. It may include live coding, any kind of novel means of computer-based production they're into. So definitely check out Conditional. If I could add a shameless plug for them.
Right, right. It's Conditional Rex. RECS.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Have you
Or
been there?
conditional.club is the
Oh,
website, and I
conditional.club.
think
Okay, got it. And they'll have a link back. All right.
yeah, I think
Awesome.
on Bandcamp it's actually Conditional Rex.
Got it. All right. Well, that certainly is something to dig into. I look forward to listening to more of that. Mike, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to have a chat. This has really been fascinating. It's been great to kind of dig deep a little bit into both the live coding and the Tidal Cycles world. I really appreciate it, man.
Yeah, no problem. It was fun.
All right. Well, with that, I'm going to let you have the rest of your day. Thank you so much and have a good one.
All right, thanks. You too.
Bye.
Many thanks to Mike for hanging out and talking about tidal cycles. Right after I did the interview, I actually went and had a workshop with him that I mentioned in the discussion. It was great. I learned a lot about this amazing tool and hope to be using it somewhat more in the future. I want to thank you for continuing to listen. I hope that you're getting something fun out of this. In the meantime, if you have any questions, comments, or ideas, feel free to reach out and let me know. My email is ddg@cycling74, and I'm always glad to hear from you. Thanks a lot. We'll catch you next time around. Bye.